Good afternoon. Welcome to Ara Museum. My name is Maggie Goshid, and we're very honored to have a very special event, the Memoir of a Stranger, a lecture by Ara Manougian, who happened to be his grandfather. Today's event is also, it's close to my heart in another way. When I was a young girl in Lebanon, I was almost maybe 10 or 11 years old. My mother told me that an Armenian hero would be coming to pick up my mom and me to go to see the Catholicos around 1965-66 it was. So it happened to be Saturday after school. So my mom said, this hero has killed a pasha. And in my mind, what is a pasha? A pasha is what I see in the pictures, dressed up in a special uniform, and expecting it to be with the guns and gunpowder. When I went down, I saw this very handsome, debonair person with a bow tie, and it happened to be Archbishop Shiragian. And that's a memory that always stayed with me. I didn't know who he was until much later on when I learned about the Nemesis. So I had a little bit of my history with one of the members of the Nemesis group. Just a brief about the memoir. Memoirs of a Stranger is a definitive non-fiction account of the hunt and successful execution of Talat Pasha, a key figure responsible for the Armenian genocide. Authored by Shahan Natali himself, the book chronicles his role as the leader of a reluctant, under-resourced team of Armenian-German operatives who carried out a mission in the shadow of post-World War I Europe. This special presentation of memoir is by his grandson, Ara Manougian, the final student and grandson, shares a unique insights passed down directly to the family and mentor-student bond. With no further ado, Ara, floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Maggie, for that introduction. And today we're going to be discussing a book that was written in the 1920s by my grandfather. It's called Memoirs of a Stranger. And as Maggie said, it chronicles the execution of one of the top leaders that was involved in the Armenian genocide. Some credit him as the architect of the Armenian genocide, although in this book that's even questioned. The book actually reveals more about the Armenian genocide than is in popular circulation and has been passed on from generation to generation. So let's just dive in here, and I'm kind of new to PowerPoint, so bear with me. So who was Shahan Natali? Well, Shahan Natali was my grandfather, for one thing. That's how I knew him as Metz Baba. And he was a very righteous man. His most famous saying that I would hear over and over again is Zur nistink shidag khosink, which is let's sit crooked, but let's talk straight. He was the president of the Armenian Writers Union at the time of Operation Nemesis, so he was very well known amongst the Armenian intellectuals and writers. He was, as Maggie said, the architect of the Armenian Operation Nemesis. And he was also known for breaking his ties with the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, which he had joined in 1905, as a youth that was looking for a way to carry out an oath that he had taken on his father's grave in 1895, in which his father and there were a dozen family members that were murdered during the genocide, during the Hamidian massacres. So let's talk a little bit about the Armenian genocide. So the Armenian genocide from 1915 to 1923, there was over there were reported 1.5 million Armenians were murdered. And that also is kind of questioned in the book because this is the popular belief yet there's a lot of evidence today that a lot of Armenians actually were forced to convert, and so they lost their Armenian identity, but yet that too is an act of genocide. It was led again by Talat Pasha, who was the target of this particular operation known as Operation Nemesis. And as we know, the international community, although at that time made a lot of noise, it was all noise, and the actual results and resolution to this genocide until this day has not been reached. So who was behind the Armenian genocide? Well, believe it or not, and I know some people at one point were calling this a conspiracy theory, but recently in our book that we published in 2019 called Betrayal, the Promise Never Kept, reveals who was actually behind the Armenian genocide. And it's a sad tale for Armenians to listen to and hear and accept after generations of hearing that it was the Turks against the Armenians and Christians against Islam. The reality is there is a thing that is referred to in Webster's dictionary as the deep state, which is bankers, the military-industrial complex, and powerful individuals. In this slide, there's a picture of many of those that were involved in the Armenian genocide, and they were the ones that actually brought to power Talat Pasha. They also brought to power Joseph Stalin. They were actually behind Joseph Stalin. There's a gentleman in the slide on the left-hand side. He's fourth one to the back, sitting down. His name is Jacob H. Schiff. He's actually related to Adam Schiff, the Congress representative, now senator. And Jacob Schiff financed the Young Turks, and he financed Joseph Stalin. And he also financed the Japanese-Russian War, which was to destabilize the Russian Tsar. So what were they after? Well, they were after oil, they were after minerals, and we'll get a little bit more into that in another slide. So the British and Young Turks' creation of Azerbaijan. So Azerbaijan, as we know, is neighboring to Armenia, not a very good neighbor, to the east. And it was actually created in 1917 by the Young Turks, who were backed by the United States interests. Specifically, I mentioned Jacob H. Schiff. There were also presidents involved. Theodore Roosevelt had been involved in some of this. So it was created in 1917, and specifically for the oil. And you'll see a newspaper article here from August 23rd, 1920, and it's of a general who would become a brigadier general. He was a colonel at the time. His name is Ulio, Brigadier General James Alexander Ulio. And he very clearly stated that the so-called Bolshevist revolution in Azerbaijan was really not engineered by the Soviet government, but rather Enver Pasha and Nuri Pasha. He identified the real leaders of this as being the British. And today you will find that British Petroleum, which is the major producer of oil in Azerbaijan today, they produce 77% of the oil, and they control 95% of all the oil exports. Basically, they created a large oil production facility called Azerbaijan. They control it today, and the Azeris are place markers. Azerbaijan, there is a region in northern Iran called Azerbaijan. That's where they borrowed the name from, and there's these claims that they're connected. Well, they actually aren't. They were Tatars. That's all chronicled in Betrayal, by the way. There's a list here on the very bottom. Those were the ones that are circled in red. Those were Armenian-owned oil producers in Azerbaijan, or in, I should say, Armenia, most eastern Armenia. Azerbaijan was actually, what it is today, is an Armenian territory legally. We'll get into that a little bit later. So as you see, most of the oil producers in that region were Armenians. And in 1917, when the Bolshevist revolution took place, everyone got kicked out. But in 1912, Stalin's handlers, who he worked for from 1902 to 1912, were the Rothschild family, and they had an oil office in Baku. They sold their interests for their oil, everything, in 1912 to Shell Oil. They financed Stalin. Stalin kicked everybody out, and they were invited back in, and they eliminated all the competition. Pretty good business, if you ask me, but very illegal until today, in fact. Colby M. Chester and the Armenian oil. So Colby M. Chester was a rear admiral who was actually sent to the Ottoman Empire at the turn of the century by President Theodore Roosevelt. And he was there to secure an oil, a mineral concessions deal, which eventually he would secure, called the Chester Concessions. And at that time, prior to the discovery of oil in the Middle East and so on, Armenia had 1/6, this is Western Armenia I'm talking about, not Eastern. Eastern Armenia is Baku, Western Armenia is Western Armenia around Lake Van. It had 1/6 of the world's accessible oil. And the Americans were claiming at that time that they were running out of oil. They were the largest producers at one point for the world oil market, and they needed more oil, especially to power their military industrial complex and their military machines, which were going from coal, so a ship that would go 6,000 nautical miles on a load of coal would go 30,000 nautical miles on a load of oil, and oil was obviously easier to load, and so it was more efficient in that manner. So they went to the Ottoman Empire to secure the oil that was found in Armenia. And at that time, it was actually known as, it was known amongst people as Armenia. The Ottoman Empire itself was an empire. It wasn't a state. It didn't own territory. So when it ceased to exist, whoever owned that territory prior to the formation or the arrival of the Ottoman Empire 600 years earlier, it reverted back to those states. Armenia had a very large territory, and it was very oil rich and mineral rich. So that became the motivation to get rid of the Armenians, because the Armenians did try to make deals. There's many books that were written at the time where they were courting specifically the United States to get oil deals and mineral deals, but they wanted a fair price for what they had to offer. So stolen oil is cheaper, because if you're a party of that, you get your share, you get your loot. So that's Colby M. Chester, the rear admiral, who is featured in here. He even confesses to everything to a newspaper person before he dies. A few years before he dies, he started talking a lot, and he gave the whole story, naming names, who was involved, and so on. You can find that in the book Betrayal. So Stalin betrayed Armenia, as we know, on July 5th, 1921. He basically arbitrarily gives Artsakh, which was definitely Armenian, and it had been agreed by the authorities at the time that it was Armenian, and he arbitrarily gives it to the control to Azerbaijan. There was no legal consent from the Armenians. The Armenians didn't agree to it, and so this also foreshadows, as it says, the ethnic cleansing that we saw in 2023. So, Operation Nemesis was supposed to take place. The popular story is, and there's a song even, which is called Gili Litsk, and it talks about how there was a decision made at the 9th General Assembly, and the Armenian Revolutionary Federation decided that they would assassinate Talat Pasha. The truth is that at the 9th General Assembly, Shahan Natali was present. He was the United States delegate, and he presented the operation, which at that time was called Haduk Corps Special Mission. Later on, it's more popularly known as Operation Nemesis. And by the way, Shahan Natali's nickname or code name was Nemesis. That's why I think they call it Operation Nemesis, because it was his creation. So, at the 9th General Assembly, he was allowed to present the operation at the very last day, almost the very last agenda item. And you'll see in this picture that's up here of the 9th General Assembly, you can tell the people who were not happy with the results of the ARF leadership, the top leadership, who would later on be found in exile in Lebanon, and they became teachers and principals of schools and whatever. They were against it, and they basically said that the price we paid for the for our independence was this loss that we have that had no country has ever had before, but we can no longer resort to these types of tactics, meaning the assassination of Talat and others. So we're going to shelve this until the 10th General Assembly. And so from that, you will see people in this picture who are looking away from the camera. Shah Natal is right in the middle, second, third from the front, and he is looking away, as are others who were dissatisfied with this decision. And these are the people that are looking away that were the most supportive of Operation Nemesis, as far as we know. And he rejected, of course, this as moral weakness and complicity. And later on, Shah Natal would find out that those same leaders of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation were actually making backroom deals with Talat at the time. And he even spied on a meeting in Rome that was taking place in 1920, or the very beginning of 1921, in which the world leaders or the world powers had gathered to basically bring the Young Turks back to power, to reign over that region again. And Shahan ran into the Armenian ambassador to Italy, who this was the last day of the conference, and he went up to him, he knew him, and he said, "Look at all these Turks around here, they're speaking Turkish." And the ambassador said, "What Turks? I don't see any Turks." And he said, "I now fully understand." So Shahan returned to Berlin from Rome, and as we know, Talat was executed a couple months later. So, failed revolutionaries. So, failed revolutions of the 1800s. This is really important that we understand this. Armenia was being set up for this fall long before. I was able to track back to the Young Turks when they existed, and in newspaper articles there is a mention of the Young Turks in 1876. So, and this is all in Betrayal, by the way. You'll find all that information in Betrayal. So the Young Turks, excuse me, the Young Turks and the Greeks and the Armenians in 1896, they were going to have a revolution. They were going to try to depose the Sultan at that time and have a change in government, which they eventually did, kind of, in 1908. But the Bank Ottoman is a very important operation because one of the people involved in Operation Nemesis, one of the key figures, in a sense that he lent his name to this operation and his resources, would eventually become the Armenian ambassador to the United States, Garakin Bastovmajan, also known as Ara Manougian. And in the Bank Ottoman operation, Ara Manougian and his band, he wasn't the leader at the time, but the leader was killed, so he was second in command, and he took control of the situation. They were supposed to, this is according to a letter that Ara Manougian wrote after Bank Ottoman operation, and after they got to France, and they were being actually shipped off to Argentina, no less. They were trying to get rid of these guys, somebody was, and that wasn't the deal that they made during the Bank Ottoman operation. So he wrote a very detailed letter on what was supposed to happen. So what was supposed to happen was they were supposed to take control of the bank, and then the Greeks and the Young Turks were going to do their part in the movement, which was a greater part of the movement. They never did. So one has to ask why. Well, what resulted of this failed attempt on starting this revolution, regime change, or to depose the Sultan was about 5,000 Armenians, innocent, lost their lives because it didn't become a Greek, Young Turk, Armenian unified revolution operation. It became the Armenian troublemakers, getting out there and making demands and so on. So a bunch of Armenians were slaughtered, that was allowed, and so on. So this is basically how the Armenians were starting to be strung out by the Young Turks. And I suspect that the Young Turks, because we know who was behind the Young Turks, and I'm suspecting, I can only trace back when the 1908, prior to 1908, how they were financed by the people I mentioned earlier, but it probably was going on a lot longer than that. But of course, finding some evidence of that, I can't find it yet, so I can only report on what we have. So, what was Shah Natali's moral stances? Justice must rise above all politics and party loyalty. And he was known as saying, we are not avengers, we are executioners of justice. And that was what Shahan was all about. And in this picture, you see Sohom Montelidian and Shahan Natali right after, about a year after the operation, maybe a little less. So what was the structure of Operation Nemesis, and what was its purpose? Well, it was to target the executioners of Ottoman war criminals. It was sanctioned by not only an order by a Turkish or Ottoman court, it was a military court that found Talat Pasha and the others guilty of these crimes, and they were sentenced to death. But the British had other ideas, and as they were being held on the island of Malta, awaiting their trial and sentencing, the Pashas got on a boat it was a German torpedo boat called the Lorelei, and late at night they were snuck off and they made their way to Berlin, where they were under the protection of the German government. But the British were definitely involved in that. But besides the execution orders from the court, under the 1907 Hague Convention, laws of war, the execution was also legally carried out because the ambassador, Gadakin Basarmajan, who was in exile, gave the orders. And basically what it is anybody that's involved in an act of war is a legitimate target for execution. So Talat and all those, because they were still actively in war against Armenia, they were targets for execution, and they were legal targets. Just like today, Armenia is under occupation, and the leaders of those countries and those that support them are also today legal targets of execution if ordered. So Aliyev, Erdogan, they're all legal targets, and it's just a matter of carrying out those executions if the opportunity arises, and we'll get into that in a little bit too, because there's something interesting that's gone on recently. So, the mission and the selection. So, popular belief is Sohom Montelidian was an ARF member and he was given the task. Not true. Sohom Montelidian didn't belong to the ARF. He didn't belong to any political affiliations. He was actually a soldier under General Antranik Ozanyan, who you can see here in the slide. We have General Antranik. The one in the middle is not Yeranui Danielyan, who was the niece of, I had to use that as a place marker. This is actually Sabel Yasayan, but I put her in because she was actually very much involved also in helping Shah Natali out during these times. And then we have Sohomon on the end. And so basically, Shahan was approached by Yeranui Danielyan, the niece of General Antranik, saying there's this young man, and she had actually helped him carry out an execution of an Armenian traitor by the name of Mukardichan, who provided the name of 250 Armenian intellectuals to Talat. And so he was living, in great comfort in the Ottoman Empire in Constantinople. And Yeranui told Sohomon about this this creature or this monster. And Sohomon went ahead and executed him, basically, in the man's home, using a rifle, shooting straight through a large plate glass window. So she is the one who actually nominated Sohomon, and Sohomon was the lucky one, because there were many that wanted this position that Sohomon got. And she was lucky. And she also wanted to she thought she might marry Sohomon, and Shahan tells about this in a video, or an audio recording that he made for us when I was 5, and he talks about that episode. So, confusion amongst the ARF. So, when they did the operation in Germany, Shahan went alone. He went alone to find Talat. He was actually prepared to do whatever he had to. Had he run into Talat during this time, Shahan was prepared to carry out the task himself. And in fact, when he went to Rome, he had his gun, he had a Walther, a pistol, and he went there. He was bound and determined to stop Talat. Basically, he had to be the first one to go. So the confusion amongst the ARF was he found some ARF members in young men that were actual members of the ARF, and although the operation was not sanctioned by the ARF, in fact they were against it, because they have a secrecy clause and the organization was decentralized, they were really not allowed to they weren't allowed to talk to anybody about the operation except amongst themselves. So he had 3 recruits who actually helped him out, and it's kind of interesting when you read his memoir, the frustrations, because their hearts really weren't into it. They all had their own thing. One was just busy, one was kind of clever, but he was there to do business, and basically a reflection of what we would expect today from the Armenians that call themselves active revolutionaries and are prepared to do whatever they have to. Everyone has their own personal gains. So it's amazing that the operation even came off the way it did. It makes me think that maybe the Turks or the people that were behind the Armenian genocide were less organized than the Armenians. Because when you read Memoirs of a Stranger, it's all in here, in his own handwriting. He talks about those difficulties that he had amongst this ragtag team that he put together. So there was a lot of divisions also within the ARF at that time. And that's why he did have supporters that helped finance it, yet it wasn't sanctioned. Solomon Telilian. This one is really amazing because basically during the trial, before the trial, Shahan was still on the ground in Germany. They were trying to get him out of there because if he had gotten caught, it would have been really bad for the whole operation. So they were trying to get him out because of all the people that were involved in Germany. Those 3 operatives that he had recruited, that had they known it wasn't an officially sanctioned operation, they would not have participated, or probably not participated. But he actually hired the attorneys, and it's in the book also. Actually, it's in the conclusion, I believe, because he doesn't mention it in the memoirs because he couldn't betray the people that were working with him to that degree, especially the German officials. So he hired the attorneys. He knew the attorneys' connections to the judge that would be hearing the case. And so the Germans were pretty much, Solomon was going to get off one way or the other, as long as as long as Solomon himself didn't say the wrong things. And initially he actually had. Solomon had actually basically confessed to the police a premeditated murder. And in Germany, that is a definite death sentence. And so the attorneys, contrary to, again, another popular belief, and I have to mention that there is a memoir written by Solomon Telilian, or allegedly written by Solomon Telilian, which in fact, it was Solomon participated in the writing of it, but it was actually written by the ARF propagandist at the time, Vahan Navasartyan, very famous man. There's the ARF even has the Navasartyan Games or whatever named after him. So Vahan Navasartyan actually wrote these memoirs, and in the memoirs, they claim that Solomon had a dream, and his mother visited him in a dream and said, "You saw him, Talat, and you did nothing. Because you did nothing, you're no longer my son." And supposedly this pushed Solomon to carry out the act. And some will claim that it's a divine intervention and so on and so forth. Well, actually that story was created by the attorneys. The attorneys created this because Solomon had confessed to premeditated murder, so now they had to backtrack somehow and backpedal and get him off, otherwise he was going to be executed. So they scripted this whole episode of this dream and so on and so forth, and at the end of the day, the trial of Solomon Telilian became a trial of Talat Pasha. And this angered the heck out of the Turks and Talat's wife. And this is all chronicled, by the way, in Betrayal. There were newspaper articles at the time, they're complaining, and so on and so forth. And in fact, the trial transcript, the official trial transcript that was eventually published, was also doctored. And there's actually correspondences between the defense attorneys and the transcriptionist, the stenographer, asking, what do you want removed? What do you want, this, that, and the other. This is all in the book Betrayal. I was able to get all of those documents from various sources, including other researchers that had done some deep research. Those particular letters from the stenographer came from somebody who I credit in the book. And there were also some of the things that were removed from the official transcript. I had actually found printed in a newspaper of that time period. And they talk about Solomon claims in trial that he had seen Talat, he had witnessed Talat at the zoo, and Talat was being concerned about a sickly monkey that was there. And he asked the zookeeper about the monkey, and Solomon testified that it was amazing that this Talat could have empathy towards a monkey, but not towards the Armenian people. That was removed because had they investigated whether that actually happened or not, probably they would find out that it didn't even happen, and they just have to talk to the zookeeper, who Solomon mentioned. So Solomon was pretty much all over the place at times, and the attorneys had to reel them back in and remove stuff like that from the transcript. That whole missing episode, or that whole missing transcript, is in the book Betrayal. So at the end of the day, the trial of Solomon Telian became really a landmark trial. It was also that which inspired Raphael Lemkin to come up with the word genocide. So you could say that this was the start of the Genocide Convention, was the trial of Solomon Telian. That was the spark that caused the necessity for that. Because as we know, Raphael Lemkin had questioned his law professors of saying, what is this a crime, and how do you punish it? And he found out that it wasn't even punishable. So he pursued that for the rest of his life. So why Memoirs of a Stranger? Well, the stranger, as far as I can tell, was Shahan Natali, feeling estranged from these corrupt Armenian, or he wasn't familiar to him, the corrupt Armenian politics. And he was exiled from his own nation, basically, because of that. And he was always on the outs. He was the enemy of Armenia. Just like at times, I don't know, for those of you who know me, I've been many times called the enemy, although it's not true, the enemy of Armenia and Armenians. So it basically reflects I won't get into this any further. I could talk about this for a while. So the theme of the book is justice versus revenge, because it wasn't revenge, it was actually justice. So the Turks will lynch on of the Armenian terrorists. Well, once upon a time, my grandfather was actually proud. I remember as a kid, he would talk about this, that we're terrorists. Well, terrorists back then meant something very different than terrorists today. So back then it was more of justice-motivated acts versus what the deep state controlled governments would like you to think of terrorism, which is somebody coming and killing innocent civilians and blowing up, buildings and so on and so forth. So the book theme also includes the truth-telling in exile and national dignity and historical clarity. So if you want to learn about that, this is the book for you. So let's talk about the 2020 Artsakh War. This is really important because this all culminated what we talked about earlier with Stalin and the British and the Armenian genocide and so on, brings us to today. We have the 2020 Artsakh War. So Azerbaijan attacked Artsakh using NATO-backed Turkey, and as you see, that's a F-16 fighter. They had them up in the air during the Artsakh War, providing assistance to the drones and all the other reconnaissance stuff, and Israeli weapons supplies, which were very illegal. In 1992, the OSCE enacted an arms embargo, and this was co-sponsored by the United States, Russia, and France. And this arms embargo has been repeatedly, and until today it's in effect, repeatedly violated by, I can count at least 12 different countries. But the biggest one who supplied the weapons that made the difference between victory and defeat for Azerbaijan was Israel, who roughly 70% of the weapons used in the 2020 attack were supplied by Israel. And this is under the violation of the OSCE arms embargo, and I should note since 2005, the United States has had a mandate that they can block any third-party weapons sales and supplies from Israel to other countries. And the United States never exercised that right in light of this arms embargo. So it became this high-tech war, and Armenia lost for various reasons. I'm not going to get into the politics of this. We really shouldn't have. It didn't make sense. I lived in Artsakh for many years. I knew the stuff that we had there, and the depots, the munitions depots we had that weren't even tapped into during the 2020 offensive, and we were being held back, sadly, by Yerevan, and the current Nikol Pashinyan regime was actually holding us back. I knew a lot of people that went over there, they were ready to fight, and they couldn't even get to Artsakh because they wouldn't allow them in. And those that were in and were called back to Yerevan to rest for 2 or 3 days were not allowed to return. And that was during the time when things were turning around in favor of Armenia and pushing them out. So there's a much bigger, sinister plan of some sort going on in the background. I'm not going to get into it right now, but it clearly does exist. So the 2023 ethnic cleansing of Armenians in September 27th, 28th of 2023, the Armenians were left with no choice but to escape with their lives. The Azeris had been attacking, they had been beheading children even, just barbaric stuff. And they had been using what are really terrorists. They were the jihadists that Turkey brought in by the thousands, and they were controlling the drones, and all sorts of stuff was going on. They didn't have a chance. So the Armenians, were being attacked. The civilian infrastructure was being destroyed, which is also a war crime. All of these are war crimes, as it is, that have to be resolved at some point, and not forgotten about, and not, oh, poor us, we need to go after them, and we need to still go after them very hard. And again, as we know, like during the Armenian genocide of 1895 to 1923, the world pretty much remained silent. I mean, they were a little more noisy back then, called it what it was, but the end result is the equivalent of they remained silent. So today, Azerbaijan is holding hostages, and some of them are very prominent. You'll see Ruben Vartanyan in the upper right, and you will see a trial going on in Baku against the Armenians. And amongst one of the charges that Ruben Vartanyan is facing is his support for this thing called Operation Nemesis 2.0, which is to target Azeri diplomats. I don't believe that Ruben Vartanyan is involved in such an operation. I won't discount that such an operation exists or doesn't exist, so I won't even talk about that. But I will say that Ruben Vartanyan is definitely not somebody that would be involved in something like that. He is a person who, with all good intentions for Armenians in every possible way, has done what he can. Yes, there are people on trial there that should be on trial, but not by an Azeri court. I can safely say that. I know most of the people that are in there behind the glass. So that's what's going on today. So let's talk about the territories, because this is really important. This is something that Armenians need to really understand. Actually, the world needs to understand. Why conquest versus legal ownership? Well, conquest is an illegal act. That's when you just go forcefully in and you take something. That doesn't give you ownership. There's today the Armenian territories, since going back to the 10th century even, and I have to put a little side note here. So Shah Natali married into the Pakraduni dynasty. My grandmother was a member of the royal family. And in fact, up until 1915, the royal family, by the Armenians at least, was still recognized. Yes, Ottoman Empire, the Ottomans, they ruled, they collected taxes and so on, but my great-grandfather would always be approached with issues that Armenians had, and he'd have to resolve them, or that was he felt the need to do that. He was recognized as one of the members of the royal family. So the royal family never signed any of the Armenian royal families never signed a legally binding treaty surrendering any territories to anybody, including they never surrendered to the Greeks any of the territories. So today what you see, legally speaking, is Armenian territory under occupation. So 90+% of our territory is literally under occupation by Turkey, Azerbaijan, who have the lion's share of the occupied territories. There's a little bit in northern Iran and in southern Georgia. And international law protects sovereignty beyond military occupation, and the land remains property of the original sovereign or royal estate. So we have claims that we can make for those lands to the United Nations, and we'll get into that right now. So, recognition is a political act, not a measure of justice. So you'll hear people saying, internationally recognized, sovereignty, so on. Those are legitimate terms, but they don't give ownership to a territory. So if somebody says, Azerbaijan is internationally recognized, what does that mean? Well, generally what that means is that Azerbaijan, let's say the United States internationally recognizes Azerbaijan. That means that they're probably doing business together, and they're recognizing each other's legal structures. So when they do business, if there's a dispute, they recognize the other's legal structure. The United States cannot internationally recognize the territory of Azerbaijan belonging to Azerbaijan, because it doesn't. They can recognize the sovereignty, because sovereignty just means you have control over something. So I could be the sovereign of this building because maybe it belongs to me, or it belongs to somebody else, but I've taken control of it, so I'm the sovereign. Well, it's the same thing with territories. Sovereignty can be over occupied territories that don't belong to somebody. So the de facto occupation versus the de jure ownership. In our case, we are the legal owners of those territories, and they've been occupying them not for hundreds of years. For instance, in the case of Azerbaijan, who claim that we've been around for 1,000 years or whatever. They've been there since 1917. The state of Turkey did not exist. There was not a state of Turkey. The Ottoman Empire was not Turkey. Though it's kind of interesting, I need to do more research on this. When did they start using the term Turkey to describe that area? That's probably where it all started, where the plan was kind of rolling in place of, we're going to take this area, we're going to make it ours as a state at some point. Because Ottoman Empire was not Turkey, they were Turkic people, and so on. Okay. So, what can be done today? We're going to wrap it up here. So the UN Security Council must act like it did. Oh, let me go back here really quick because I missed one thing. So down here is the UN Security Council Resolution number 678 from November 29, 1990, and that is a milestone in history because that was actually when a UN security force was put together to liberate Kuwait from Iraq, which Iraq had occupied. But interestingly enough, that's actually a territory of Iraq that the British separated from Iraq in the 1920s, another petroleum manufacturing facility. But nonetheless, what's important about this resolution is that there is a tool in place that can be used if we can make it work. And that's something that I am exploring currently. But basically, the UN Security Council must act like it did in 1990 for Kuwait. Armenian territories must be liberated and compensated. And so the compensation, what is that? Well, under international law, if a territory is occupied, the minerals and property cannot be disposed of or taken or whatever. So all that oil that has been taken off of the Armenian legal territories since 1917, and all that's been taken since 1923, must be, Armenians, or the Armenia, must be given reparations at the highest market value during that period of time. So this is one of our biggest stumbling blocks, because the people that were behind the Armenian genocide and the people that received these stolen minerals are not, they have nothing to gain. In fact, they have everything to lose for Armenians to have their justice and their rights to be upheld. So the United States, Europe, whoever has, Italy, big consumer of Azeri oil or Armenian oil coming from Azerbaijan, Israel, and so on. We're talking about trillions of dollars in possible reparations. So there's no reason for them to help the Armenians ascertain justice, because that is a component that has got to strike fear in them. The Rothschilds would go bankrupt if they haven't, whatever they have that's available, and all of those big, the deep state people. So Armenians must be liberated and compromised. Reparations for stolen minerals, which I just talked about. So here's what we need to do is, we need to educate people on these facts. This is not a story that's popular amongst Armenians, and it's even less popular amongst common people, because most people don't even know about the Armenian genocide, let alone this kind of stuff. And this also shows how involved we as Americans and Europeans are in this sad tragedy that happened back then and that's continuing today. So justice delayed is not justice denied, it's just justice deferred, until those with conscience speaking louder than those with guns. And lastly, some recommended reading. So we have Memoirs of a Stranger, we have Betrayal, and we have another book Shahan Natali wrote, which is out of print, but I'm going to be re-editing it and making it more current. Of course, all the books that we do, we never take anything out that Shahan Natali has written. We just add some footnotes to make it more valid and more meaningful for today. It's called The Turks and Us. And I should mention that The Turks and Us was mandatory reading during the Artsakh liberation movement. All the people that were an officer and above in the Armenian and Artsakh military have, at that time, have read Turketa Yetmek, The Turks and Us. So with that, I am done with this presentation, and we will take questions and answers, if there are any. And I know this is a very difficult subject, and I know it goes against the grain of what we've been told our whole lives and what's popular. So if there are no questions and answers, Maggie, do I just close and say goodbye?
No, I have a question.
You do have a question, okay.
I think you do what we're discussing, because I need to digest it. But how was it growing up with your grandfather as a child? We are product of my generation, that we grew up with our grandparents. My father never spoke, but my grandmother always shared stories, but positive stories. But all our surrounding was always hush hush. Amote, we cannot discuss it, because that was the mode. How did it feel? Because you come from a product of a family that was more open-minded, more Western way of thinking, and you grew up here.
We were taught to think out of the box from the get-go as a child. We had, so amongst my family, my parents and siblings, we were 4 brothers. I was the youngest. So in 1975, my parents shipped us off to stay with my grandparents for 3 months. And we only learned, we thought we were just going there to have fun. We had fun, obviously. My grandmother loved us, my grandfather loved us, my aunt, who actually was at the Ararat home here in her final days. They took great care of us, took us around. It was 1975. It was during the bicentennial. My grandfather studied us, and he talked to us. And he basically, there was an AGBU banquet at the Prudential Center in Boston. And 4 people of the 6 in the house went. One of us stayed behind, and I was the one that stayed behind. And that night, my grandfather, basically, I remember as a child, it was almost like a bombshell being dropped, basically said, "You're going to continue what I began." And I opposed. I was very much against it, and until the age of 16, he worked on me, and there were people that were students of his over time that I had met and talked to, and even after he passed away, I wasn't really convinced that should be the one. I don't know what conversations he had with my brothers, if he did, but I do know that that was the only time that somebody stayed home alone with him during that whole summer. So I'm just assuming, I've never really talked about this with my brothers, so I don't know. But I do know that his desire, even when I was 5 years old, and he sat down and made a 6-hour and 15-minute recording of his life and the whole operation. So there's some transcripts in both these books, in Betrayal and in Memoirs of a Stranger, from that 1970, September 6th, 1970 recording. And he was very stern. I remember him being very stern with my brothers. He was very stern with both of them, actually. I have more my older brother, but he wasn't with me for some reason. It was kind of interesting. And I don't know if that's because there was something else that, I don't know the reason, but I do remember that. So he was very loving, but for the outside world, he was a son of a gun. People respected him a lot, but he was not a friendly person to, for instance, the clergy would come over to visit, and then they would want to offer money because he was this writer, and he would kick them out of their house. He said, "I don't want your money." And he literally, my Aunt Etna would describe these scenes that were very ugly. So he was a very principled person. He hated lying. He hated dishonesty. He hated corruption. All the things that I've learned to hate comes from him. I mean, he was truly my mentor of whatever education I've had. And I have to tell you that I am a junior college dropout. I hated junior college. I knew I would hate college, so I'm pretty much self-educated. The education that I have, if there is a formal education, came from Shahan Natali and my parents, and whatever reading I did and everything beyond. And again, these students of his that I met over the years that shared things with me. So growing up in our house was very different, and we had a very different understanding of a lot of things. And we were taught to avoid armament politics because they were useless for what we needed to do. So that was, growing up in our house, it was very different. We were taught to think out of the box and very open-minded, and everyone was equal in our house. Even my parents, there was no pecking order. We had almost an equal voice. Yeah, my father would sometimes have to put his foot down. My mother would try occasionally when she saw things were getting out of hand, but she was usually unsuccessful. And we were all taught to think, for ourselves.
Maybe I'm talking out of turn, I'm sorry. I know we discussed a little bit about the archives. Are they going to be open to other scholars to review the archives? Because until now, you're the only one you're publishing, of course, for personal reasons, but is going to be a time where it's going to be available for scholars to...
Yes, at some point, so they've been digitized, and I may have to do that again too, because the quality of, at least they're preserved, but now with technology the way it is, a higher quality would probably be more desirable so they can actually be printed and published. So eventually my vision is to make it available digitally to anybody, and then the originals at some point will be donated to a university for preservation. Although, again, it's only worth that paper, I guess, is what it's worth for somebody to be able to see it up close. So,
are there any interests from any?
Over the years, there have been many interests, and they're not always scholars. We had people that have approached us that my mother would basically kick, just like my grandfather kicking the clergy out. My mother has been known to be very kind to people and then sending them on their way with nothing. So there was a book published in 2015 called Operation Nemesis by Ara Manougian, and he came and he demanded every scrap of paper that was in Shah Natali's archive, and he was shown the door. So, but he's not a scholar. So, but if a scholar approached us, I would be more than happy to talk with them, and I would have to vet them because there's still a lot of political scholars who have their political motives, and unfortunately, those are people that I would be happy to talk to, but I would definitely want to vet before giving them access to anything.
First, thank you for the lecture, Ara. There are two questions always in my mind, and probably you will eliminate me on those questions. We all know that Shah Natali was the mastermind of Nemesis, but I would like to know what was the real reason he was detached. He did detach himself from ARF. Of course, a lot of people say other things, and isolated himself. That's my first question. Second, after moving into the United States, did he collaborate with U.S. government? Thank you.
Thank you. So for your second question, I don't know the answer to that. I do know that while he was on his deathbed in 1983, my grandmother had a visitor at the door, and they were FBI agents, and they were looking for Shah Natali. And what had happened at that time was, apparently there was some operation going on, maybe it was Asala connected or ARF connected, Justice Commando connected, named after codename Shah Natali. And so my grandmother sat them down for quite a long time. My grandmother was known for talking. So she talked to them for quite a bit and educated them about Armenian history and the genocide and so on. And then they concluded their meeting with her allowing them to walk up to the second floor of their home to witness Shah Natali on his deathbed. And his deathbed, basically Shah Natali worked every day from noon until midnight. That was his schedule. He would get up at noon, have breakfast, and then he would sit in his chair, which I have that chair. He would sit in his chair and he would work the whole day on his papers and until the very end, 3 months prior to his death. And then he was bedridden and he was having dreams of playing poker with people and stuff like that. So that was the connection I know. I do one day, and I don't know why I procrastinate this, I do want to request his FBI file because it should be available. So it'd be interesting to see whether he actually collaborated. I should note that during on the onset of World War II, Shah Natali's one of his bodyguards had become an attorney, and the New England Jewish, Bar Association, some organization of Jewish attorneys, had approached Shah Natali to execute Adolf Hitler, and they just wanted Shah Natali to name his price. And so, knowing what he knows of what it costs to do Nemesis and so on, he put out a price of $1 million that they would have to deposit. And apparently they thought that was too expensive, that if there were 6 million Jews killed, 6 cents per person was too much money to spend to get rid of Hitler. And they had been trying to get rid of Hitler for a long time. Shah Natali, I have no doubts in my mind, zero doubts in my mind, that if he had taken that operation on, Adolf Hitler would not have carried out the Holocaust. So that's the extent that I know of any kind of connections with any government. As for the real reason or the reason why, in 1919, Shah Natali handed in his resignation at the 9th General Assembly, and they declined him. They wouldn't take his resignation. In 1929, in Paris, I believe it was, either it was Paris or it was the United States, Shah Natali, it's recorded somewhere, Shah Natali was a bureau member, a top bureau member, and he had left for the day, but he had forgotten his hat at the office. So he went back to the office to get his hat, and the lights were on, and the door was a little bit ajar. So he walked up to the door and he overheard the other bureau members talking about a deal that they were working on with the Turks to come back into power. And so Shah Natali, the next day, was prepared, confronted them about this, and he left the party. He resigned at that point. Whether they took his resignation or not, whether there was even a resignation, I don't know the details of that. But he definitely left the party. And following that, they actually tried to assassinate Shah Natali twice that we know of. Once was by a young Italian hitman who was supposed to come into a cafe that Shah Natali frequented, but Shah Natali had been told by loyalists within the ARF party that this was going to happen. So his bodyguards, one of them, the same one that made contact with the Jewish lawyers in New England, they were waiting. And they knew exactly who this hitman was when he walked in the door. So they invited him over to the table that they were sitting at. And with their guns drawn under the table, pointed towards the hitman, and they let him know that, you're not going to be able to do anything here. They educated him on what was going on. And he had been lied to by the ARF of why. Because I don't know, and don't ask me how I know this, but amongst hitmen, you have to have a legitimate reason to kill somebody. Most of the good hitmen, or the more honest hitmen, they want to do a just hit, not just some act of revenge or whatever the case may be, or some just vindictive act. So he hadn't been told the true story. And so this young Italian hitman pledged his loyalty to Shah Natali and said, I will go back and kill those who hired me. And he said, no, there will be no need for that. And the second time that they attempted to, Shahan was in his New England office, and there was a knock at the door. And it was somebody from the ARF that he knew. And he said, come in. And he said, he walked up, he said, sit down. He goes, no. He walked up to Shah Natali's desk table, and he pulled out a gun. And he said, they sent me here to kill you, but I can't. And he put the gun on the table and walked out. And Shah Natali wrote about that in his paper, like the next edition. It was in the paper. Just one embarrassment and one failure after the other. Just like a lot of their policies, those were failures also. The third one I'll share is World War II, France. My mother was 3 years old, and they put out an operation to kidnap my mother, who was 3. And it got back to my grandmother, or my great-grandmother, who, again, was a member of the Royal Armenian family. So, there's this inside network. So word got back to them that this was going to happen. So my mother remembers having this trip to the south of France for a vacation, and they diverted that kidnapping from happening. But this is the reason why Shah Natali left the organization, was because in 1929, they were ready to make a deal with the Turks to come back to power and take over Soviet Armenia, basically, which was, at that time, was Soviet Armenia. And none of those things would have happened, by the way. I'm sure of that.
I have one. Did he ever discuss in his memoirs about the assassination of the Armenian bishop in New York?
Of Turian, no, well, not in this memoirs. I haven't even read through all of his diaries, so that would have been 1933. No, I don't know, but interestingly enough, in the book Betrayal, I actually have a small booklet that was written about that, and I wrote the introduction to that section about the Turian thing. But as far as Shah Natali goes, I don't know whether something like that might exist in some of his diaries. Because his more detailed diaries were during the operations, not during non-operation times. So I'm not sure what his position was on that.
Interesting question.
I was wondering